Hi there, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about FDA regulations, and I've chosen to break up this lecture into two parts. Part one's a little longer, excuse me, than part two, but I think doing this will probably be a little less boring, shall I say, and hopefully just a little bit easier for you to retain the information. So here we go. We really need to talk about the regulations before we jump into the rest of the semester. We're going to lay a lot of groundwork today. So here we go with part one. FDA regulations are, and we talk about the Food and Drug Administration, right? All the way through this class and other classes, because the FDA has the authority to approve new drugs. So we're going to be very interested in FDA regulations. And the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR, is where all of the federal laws are published annually. In our case, the regulations that apply to what a clinical research coordinator does are published annually in April. Whether there are any changes or not, they're published every year. Everything that we're going to look at regarding clinical trials is found in Title 21. We won't need to go anywhere else, which is good. So why do you need to know these things? So what does this have to do with I just want to get on, I just want to learn how to be a research coordinator. The CFR, so the Code of Federal Regulations, is the framework that makes sure that we are protecting people that are participating in clinical research. If you remember back to the last lecture, we talked about the Institutional Review Board and how they're like the ethics police. So much of what we do as coordinators has to do with making sure that people that are participating in the trial are protected and they're not being taken advantage of. So this is the legal framework to make sure that that happens. The Code of Federal Regulations, and I'll just call it the code from here on out, it also determines what are your responsibilities as a CRC and what should you do as a CRC. Remember before I said that all of your work is delegated to you by the investigator? Well, the investigators very clearly, and we'll get to this in a little bit, very clearly delineated the roles and responsibilities of the investigator, which then can be delegated to you. So this is very important for you to understand what your role is. And learning about the law improves your analytical reasoning skills, and you need to be able to make good decisions as a CRC. So you can go through all these classes and you can say, I was taught this in college and this is the way I was taught to do it. But at the end of the day, I want everybody that leaves this program to be able to make decisions for themselves based on the Code of Federal Regulations. I'm incredibly human. I'm incredibly flawed. I could tell you something that's wrong. I hope I don't, but it's very possible, right? So you have to be able to stand on your own 2 feet and say, I am doing X, Y, and Z because the Code of Federal Regulations says that's what I should do. Not because Heather said it or because somebody else taught you at work, but because you know how to go to the law and find it yourself. And we're going to, when you get to the good clinical practice class, we'll spend a lot of time there. So I just want you to understand there's a reason why I want you to be able to stand on your own feet. The first thing we need to talk about is the code citation format. This is what a sample citation will look like. You might have seen this sort of in other places, other citations of the federal law. So this is how you would read it. That 14 CFR would be just read as Title 14. So in our case, it'll be 21 CFR. That nice little icon means part. 1240 is just 1240. And then after the period means section. So that original citation would be read as Title 14, Part 1240, Section 100. When you go ahead and you write it, especially if you're going to be answering quiz or test questions, it would be written, instead of that nice icon, that nice little squiggly mark, you would just write it as 21 CFR Part 312, Section 100. So you don't have to worry about finding that on your computer. I just want you to know writing part is pretty much what everybody does. So you'll find that when people are communicating between sponsor and site, they will write part and things like that. So you'll probably see it on slides, but in terms of just talking and responding to discussion questions and things like that, you can just write part. So I do want to mention very quickly that the CFR has a basic outline. There will be subparts to every section. Sometimes it'll only be subpart A. Sometimes it'll be subpart A through M. So there will be subparts. Every subpart, and I would start with A, the very first thing you'll find is the scope. So if you are digging around in the code and you're trying to find a specific bit of information, the very first place I would go to look at is the scope. It will tell you what that subpart A is going to discuss. It'll save you a lot of reading. So if you read the scope, you'll know if whether or not you're in the right place. Then they'll have some definitions. They'll say, what is an investigator? What is a sponsor? Those kinds of basic definitions. Look at those, because what you think and maybe the way you use a word in your everyday professional life might be a little different than the way the code defines it. So make sure you look at those definitions, and then the implementation section is helpful once you know you're in the right place. So I do want you to know that there's an outline, and it will help you to look at the outline. So let's jump in a little bit. Let's start with section 11. This is regarding electronic records and signatures. Now, this is a very small little bit of the code, but it is very important and became more important in the past 20 years because it talks about electronic data and electronic documents. And it addresses the responsibility of sponsors and investigators to assure that there is reliability and integrity in those documents. You know, honestly, I've been around long enough to say that I worked in a time when there were not electronic documents, and everything was hard copy. So this is, you know, really been in the past 20 years, and it's basically to create some assurance for the FDA that the electronic data is reliable. So this applies to electronic medical records, which almost all practices have now. This also applies to data transmitted from an automated instrument into a computerized system. So a good example is if you're in the hospital, you have an electronic medical record, and every morning when you get lab work done, those lab results automatically populate into the electronic medical record. So there is a data transmission there. So also this applies if there is a hard copy that is then later entered in a computerized system, especially in cases where then the electronic data is submitted to the sponsor. Then this applies, and then automatically recorded by a computerized system. So an EKG. An EKG would record right, the rate and rhythm of the heart, but it prints out as a computerized record, but it doesn't necessarily automatically populate into another system. So that would also apply. So we'll get into 50. Section 50 addresses the informed consent process. Now, I will warn you, I'm not going to warn you, that's not fair, it's not really a warning, but I'm going to tell you we're going to talk a lot later in the semester about the consent process. So this is important that you understand the law around the consent process. And the whole informed consent process is really designed to protect the rights and welfare of people participating in the trial. This is a method of communicating with them. And we will talk about the informed consent process in every class. It's incredibly important. This is the way the investigator demonstrates to the world that the rights and the welfare of the participants are being maintained. Applies to all clinical research under FDA jurisdiction. So there are lots of sections within 50, Part 50, but we're going to just sort of hit the high points of these. 20 is the general requirements for consent. And these include things like the investigator has to allow sufficient opportunity for patients to consider participation. So it's not just enough to say to someone, hey, do you want to participate in a clinical trial? It's really a matter of saying, would you like to participate in a clinical trial? Why don't you go home and think about it overnight? We're going to give you some time to become aware of what the trial is. We'll give you some information. You can talk about your family with it. So the idea is not to create duress and pressure someone into participating. Now, overnight is really generous. It doesn't have to be overnight, but you have to give those folks some time to consider. The consent has to be given in a language understandable to the subject or the representative. This means that in South Texas, we have most trials will have a consent form that is in English and in Spanish. But if someone comes in and speaks Farsi, you cannot give them an English or a Spanish consent. So there will be situations in which the consent has to be translated into another language. And it also has to be at a reading level that people can understand it. So, you know, what a PhD investigator would be able to understand is very different than a lot of other people. So you really have to have it in a very understandable, 5th, 6th grade reading level. And then the consent, we're going to get into what's involved in the consent, but the consent cannot have any language where the subject waives any legal rights. So there's still the right to sue, there's still the right to seek, legal avenues. And so you cannot waive any of those rights for people participating in the clinical trial. There are some opportunities where these requirements there can be exceptions. Now you have to, I said the consent is required for all research under FDA jurisdiction. If you meet all these criteria, there is an exception that can be granted, and all of them have to be met. Just not one or two or three of them, all of them have to be met. The first one is there has to be a life-threatening situation which requires the use of the test article. And the test article in the code means either the drug that's being developed or a medical device. So this would apply to either. And the informed consent cannot be obtained because of an inability to communicate with the subject. And this is not a language barrier. This means medically this person's not able to communicate. There's not enough time to obtain consent from the subject's legal representative. So if I were in an auto accident, and this maybe would apply to me, if my husband were out of the country and unable to contact him, then time might be an element. There might be a pressure of time that would say, okay, we can go ahead and do this. But if there is enough time to contact my husband, who is my legal representative, then that has to happen. And then the last thing, and all of these things have to be in place, there is no alternative treatment. So there's really nothing else. If there's something else out there that is as good as the test subject, then you have to give the standard therapy. But if there's no alternative treatment, then you don't have to obtain consent, right? So you have to have all four of these things in place. And you can see that these four things together is probably not really common. The trick to this is if an investigator goes ahead and gets an exception from the requirements because all four of these things are in place, that investigator has to have an independent peer review of other doctors of what he did, and the IRB must be notified in writing. So by doing so, by making this peer review and IRB notification, it creates a little bit of accountability so investigators can't just sort of make this work for them. So there has to be some accountability, and the IRB, being the ethics police, want to know about this. Now, there are also some exceptions in case of emergency research, and there's a lot of duplication between exception from requirements and exception from requirements in case of emergency research because they look an awful lot like each other. So the exception from requirements stands, and there's some additional things here. So for an emergency research, there is no reasonable way to identify patients prospectively. So if you were involved in emergency research and you were a trauma investigator, there would be no way to go to say to the IRB that we are going to find people who are going to have a motor vehicle accident in advance. There's no way to be able to anticipate who would be in that pool of people you'd be looking for. Participation holds out the prospect of direct benefit to the subject, and the risks do not exceed standard therapy. So there has to be some holdout that something good is going to happen to the subject. There is just really no way that you could perform this emergency research without requesting this waiver. And that at the end of the day, the investigator is still going to have to make efforts to contact legally authorized representatives. So there's still some accountability there, and these legal representatives could say, this is not what Heather would want, and I want to withdraw her from the trial. So there's still that accountability that even though perhaps I cannot communicate for myself, the investigator will be in touch with someone who can communicate on my behalf. Honestly, I wanted to make you aware of exceptions, and I also wanted to make you aware of emergency research because the law oftentimes does allow for exceptions, and I wanted to make you aware that there are these circumstances. I have never been involved in emergency research. I've never worked with anybody who has, but it is it is a field of clinical research that is very different from other ones. So I just wanted to make you aware. Oh, sorry, the IRB has reviewed and approved the procedures. The IRB is always going to be involved. The IRB has to understand and approve of all of these things. Now, the elements of consent will apply to you. They apply to everybody. And so the elements of consent are going to be what is in the consent form. Now, before I get into what are the 8 required elements and then some optional elements, I will say to you that for many research coordinators, writing the consent form is part of the job. You will work very closely with your sponsor in the consent form, but these 8 elements have to be included. You have to have a statement that the study involves research, including what is the purpose of the research, how long will that patient participate in the research, what kind of procedures will be involved, and what are the experimental procedures. Sometimes it gets confusing if you have a disease between what is medical care and what is clinical research care. So these things have to be all outlined. The reasonably foreseeable risks or discomforts. This will be in the consent form based off the preclinical research. So if this is a phase 1 study, this will involve what we found out from the animal studies, because you try to anticipate the risks based on that. And then as you go through phase 1 and phase 2 and into phase 3 studies, the risks and discomforts will grow, because as people are on the trials, you find out more and more risks and discomforts. So you're going to put in there what is reasonably foreseeable, and this will grow with time. Are there any expected benefits? Reasonably, what can this person anticipate from participating? And then what are appropriate alternative procedures? And by putting this in, it allows potential participants to decide whether they want to be in the treatment or whether they want to go back and try some standard therapy. So it does not leave them with the belief that there's no other option. So those are 4 things. Here's some more. Number 5, a statement describing confidentiality of records. And most people believe that their electronic medical record will be reviewed only by their healthcare providers. But in our case, there is going to be records that could be reviewed by the FDA. So that has to be included in there. And we'll talk later in the semester about when the FDA might review those records. If there's more than minimal risk, an explanation regarding compensation, and an explanation as to whether any other medical treatments are available if the injury occurs. So if there is risk involved, and that's been explained to me in the consent form, I also need to know what will happen if I actually have an adverse event. Something bad happens, I have a side effect. What are the treatments going to be? Are they going to cost me money? And so that's an important consideration. Contact information for who to contact if you have questions, and then who to contact in the event of a research-related injury. This is typically the investigator, the principal investigator. If there are multiple investigators on a trial, it would be just the principal one. And so people need to have this information so later on if they have questions. And then lastly, a statement that participation is voluntary. If that participant decides not to participate, if that potential person says, I don't want to do this, there's no penalty, loss of benefit. The subjects then, if they are enrolled, can discontinue at any time, and that there's no penalty for any of these things. And if you stop right now and you think about these 8 things, these would be 8 things that would be very important for you if you were considering whether or not to participate in a clinical trial. And so that's why the code is put in these 8 things. You will find them in every consent form. How they're worded might vary a little bit, but these 8 basic principles will be included. These will all help that person decide whether they want to participate or not. So every consent form has these 8. There are also some additional elements. These are optional, and oftentimes they are included. And this will be up to the sponsor and the institutional review board whether they get included. The first one is a statement regarding risks currently unforeseeable. And that basically just says, here are the risks that we are anticipating might happen to you, and then we know that there are things that we can't anticipate. Unforeseeable, they might also occur. So do not think that that list is all-inclusive. There are circumstances, and we'll talk about this again later in the semester, in which the PI, the principal investigator, may withdraw a participant without the participant's approval. Typically, this is if the risk is really high and something has happened to the study where people are at risk of very serious things such as permanent disability or death. So the PI can withdraw participants whether the participants like it or not. If there are any additional costs to the subject, the consequences of withdrawal of consent and procedures for early termination, and this is oftentimes included under that number 8 from those essential elements, and significant new findings developed during the course of the research will be provided to the subject. So when things change, especially with risks, that the participants will be made aware of that. So whether these things are included or not, it really depends on your sponsor and your IRB, and the number of subjects expected. I personally never understood why this matters. Statistically, there will be a set number of subjects that will be expected, and for some reason this has been included. And if I was participating in a clinical trial, this wouldn't matter to me at all. But anyway, that's also included as an additional element. And then documentation of consent. There's a written consent document. I just mentioned all those elements that go in there, right? So this is going to be written down. IRB approves the written form. And then there's also a short form. The written consent document is the really most common one. The short form also exists. It's also an IRB approved. It's a written consent document stating that the elements were presented orally. So if you were to have an illiterate participant, you would use a short form because you would have to read the document to them orally. And this basically says, yes, I read those, this is what was included and this is what I read to them. And either the written consent document or the short form will be signed and by at least the participant on the trial, at the very least. And a copy of the signed consent form is always provided to the participant. You keep the original at the research site, and the copy is given to the participant. So later on, they can go home and they can review again what they agreed to. They can show it to their family when they have questions. And really one of the most important things in there is I always told people, here's the name and the phone number of who you call if you have a problem. So that's why you give it to the participant. So that's how we document the consent process, either the written document 99% of the time or the short form, which is very rare. '54 talks about financial disclosure. It addresses the FDA's ability to assess the reliability of data within the context of financial relationships. We'll talk more about this when we get to the ethics class. But the IRB wants to know whether those financial relationships have maybe created some bias. It applies to all the sponsors and all the investigators. Now we'll talk about the IRBs. And we have 5 subparts here, and we're just going to hit on 2 of them really quickly. Membership is the first one. An institutional review board, just as a reminder, is those ethics police. So it's an independent party, and it reviews research to make sure that the rights and welfare of people are being protected. And so there are requirements for membership. There is a minimum of 5 members required. You can have way more than 5 members. The Health Science Center has a huge number of people on their IRB because it's very busy. So you have to have at least 5 members, and they have to have varying backgrounds. One has to be a scientific member. You need at least one person to understand the basis of the research that's being reviewed. One lay member, and what I mean by a lay member is someone from the community who's not scientific. Oftentimes these can be like clergy members. You might have a person who's very involved in the local community, council member, that kind of thing, and a lawyer in the area. But somebody who is not scientific and a member that's not affiliated with the institution, and this keeps it from being a good old boys network. or people just rubber stamp each other's reviews, and they approve things without a lot of rigorous conversations and discussions. So, not affiliated. Experts can come in to provide advice. So if you have this IRB and they say, you know, this, even the scientific members say, this is a little bit outside of our area of expertise, let's invite some people in. You can have experts come and answer questions. They're not voting members, though. And members have to recuse themselves from meetings in which they have a conflict of interest. So if you're a scientific member of the IRB at the Health Science Center, you might also at some point be submitting research for them to review. And in that case, then you would not be allowed to vote, and you should recuse yourself. Typically, this is why there are more than 5 members. So if you need 5 members at a minimum to vote, and one person recuses themselves, you have a problem. So most IRBs will have many members. So then the functions and operations of the IRB. The IRB has really sort of 3 things it can do to research. It can approve clinical research trials, it can require modification to the clinical research trial, or it can disapprove the clinical research trial. 3 things: approve, require modification, or just flat out disapprove. By and large, require modification is typically the very first common response. Disapprove is pretty unlikely because most people involved, sponsors and investigators, know how to write a clinical research protocol. So typically just a flat out disapproval is really uncommon. There's enough expertise that what is submitted to the IRB will either be approved or required modification. The likelihood that you'd get an approval right out of the gate is really uncommon too. Typically the IRB will really go through and vary with a fine-tooth comb, look at a lot of stuff that we'll get into later, and will typically require modification for 1 or 2 or maybe 3 times before they approve it. But that's what the IRB's primary function is: approve, require modification, or disapprove research. Also approves consent form content and formats. If the IRB is the ethics police and the consent form is the place by which we demonstrate respect for the decision making of the participant, then the content and the format are going to be very important to the IRB. It's typically at an annual review. If it's a high risk study, it might be more frequently than that, but they will have a continuing review where they say, how's it going? And then there are, and we're not going to get into this today, some opportunities where they can review something in an expedited format. So sometimes it's sort of very quick and fast review time. So that is really the function of what the IRBs can do in their operations. Here's my reference for everything: the CFR Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21. This link is searchable. You will find that when you get into good clinical practice that we'll use this link a lot. Anyway, that was part 1. Thanks for sticking around. Let me know if you have questions. Inevitably you will. And I will see you very soon for part 2. Take care.